Fingers dug into my bicep, manicured nails biting through the cheap wool of my rented suit. "Go sit with the kitchen staff, Frank," my daughter-in-law's father whispered, his breath sour with expensive gin. "We need the family photos to look cohesive." I didn't scream. I didn't cause a scene. I just nodded. That was my first mistake. My second was letting them think they had won. Sweat pooled at the base of my neck, trapped beneath a collar that was half an inch too tight. The room smelled of roasted figs, heavy balsamic glaze, and the metallic tang of wealth, that sharp ozone scent of air conditioning pumping through a house too large for its occupants. It was Leo and Stella's 5th anniversary. They had rented out an estate in the hills, a sprawling monstrosity of glass and reclaimed wood that looked less like a home and more like a modern art museum. String music scraped against my eardrums. A quartet in the corner sawed away at their cellos, churning out something atonal and frantic that made my jaw clench. I stood by a faux marble pillar, holding a glass of club soda. Condensation dripped onto my fingers, cold and sharp. I watched my son. Leo was laughing. He wore a custom navy blazer, holding a champagne flute by the stem, his head tilted back. Stella stood beside him, draped in emerald silk, a proprietary hand resting flat against his chest. They looked like a magazine spread. They looked like strangers. I rubbed my thumb over the rim of my glass. My hands are still rough, even though I retired 5 years ago. 30 years of hauling scrap metal, managing diesel mechanics, and signing manifests with grease-stained fingers leaves a permanent topography on your skin. I tried to keep them in my pockets most of the night. "Frank." The voice came from behind me, smooth and heavily buttered. I turned. Warren, Stella's father. He was a tall man, perpetually tanned, with silver hair swept back so perfectly it looked painted on his skull. He smelled of mint and juniper. "Warren," I said. My voice sounded gravelly, entirely out of place over the hum of polite conversation. "Enjoying the spread?" he asked, not looking at me. His eyes were darting around the room, tracking the caterers, the guests, the photographer setting up a tripod near the floor-to-ceiling windows. "It's nice," I said. "Leo looks happy." Warren finally looked at me. His gaze dropped briefly to my suit, a charcoal two-piece I'd bought off the rack a decade ago for funerals. I saw the microscopic tightening of his lips. The distaste wasn't loud. It was a quiet, suffocating thing. "Yes, well, Stella has done wonders for him," Warren said. He stepped closer. The proximity felt entirely aggressive. "Listen, Frank. The photographer is ready for the main spread, the legacy shots." "Right," I said, shifting my weight. "Where do you need me?" Warren didn't answer immediately. He reached out, his hand clamped onto my left arm, right above the elbow. The grip was shockingly tight. His manicured thumb dug into my muscle, a physical restraint dressed up as a friendly gesture. "Go sit with the kitchen staff, Frank," he said. The words were a quiet hiss, pitched perfectly so only I could hear them over the cellos. "Just until dinner is served. The lighting is tricky, and we really need the core family photos to look cohesive. You understand? A certain aesthetic. You're hovering, and it's throwing off the room." My brain stalled. The machinery just stopped working. I expected to feel a sudden surge of righteous anger. I expected to throw my drink in his face, or shove him backward, or yell something that would make the string quartet screech to a halt. That's what happens in movies. In reality, my stomach plummeted. A hot, wet shame flared in my cheeks. I felt suddenly hyper-aware of my scuffed leather shoes, the slight fraying at my cuffs, the fact that I had dirt permanently lodged under my thumbnail no matter how hard I scrubbed. I felt exactly like a trespasser. "The kitchen staff," I repeated. It wasn't a challenge. It was a stupid, hollow echo. "Just through the swinging doors, old boy," Warren said, patting my arm twice, patronizingly, before letting go. "Grab a crab cake. We'll send someone to fetch you when they start the toasts." He turned his back on me and walked away. I stood there for 3 seconds. I looked over at Leo, my boy. He was standing 20 feet away. He had seen the interaction. I knew he had. His eyes met mine for a fraction of a second, a deer caught in the headlights. Then, deliberately, he looked down at his watch, the heavy, silver watch I had bought him when he graduated business school. He checked the time, turned his shoulder to me, and laughed at something Stella's mother said. My chest caved in. It was a physical collapse. I didn't cause a scene. I lowered my head, staring at the polished oak floorboards, and I walked toward the back of the house. Pushing through the swinging wooden doors, I felt like I was wading through wet cement. The kitchen was a different planet. The air was 10 degrees hotter, thick with the scent of sizzling butter, roasted garlic, and the sharp tang of panicked sweat. Stainless steel countertops gleamed under harsh fluorescent lights. A dozen people in white aprons were moving in a chaotic, synchronized dance. Knives chopped against heavy boards. A dishwasher blasted scalding water in the corner, emitting clouds of humid steam. I stood just inside the door, my club soda still gripped in my hand. Nobody noticed me for a full minute. Then, a young woman carrying a tray of empty, sauce-streaked ramekins nearly slammed into my chest. She gasped, stumbling back. Her hair was plastered to her forehead with sweat. "Oh shit, sorry," she blurted out. Then she blinked, taking in my suit. Guests aren't supposed to be in here, sir. The bathrooms are down the hall to the left." "I'm not looking for the bathroom," I said. My voice was completely flat. "I was told to wait in here." The woman frowned, wiping her hands on a towel tucked into her apron. "Wait in here? For what?" "For the photos to be over." Understanding dawned in her eyes. It wasn't confusion anymore. It was pity. Pure, undiluted pity. It hit me harder than Warren's grip had. She looked at me the way you look at a stray dog limping down the shoulder of a highway. "Right," she said softly. You can sit over there, by the prep station. It's out of the way." She pointed to an aluminum stool tucked next to a massive humming refrigerator. I walked over and sat down. The metal was cold through my trousers. I sat there for what felt like hours. I watched the staff plate tiny, intricate appetizers, spherified olives, foams, things that didn't look like food. My mind started playing tricks on me, pulling up memories I hadn't touched in years. I remembered sitting on a plastic milk crate in our old garage 30 years ago. It was a Tuesday night. It was raining. I was wearing oil-stained coveralls, eating cold meatloaf out of a Tupperware container because I had to pull a double shift. Leo was 6. He had run into the garage in his pajamas carrying a broken toy truck. I had put my dinner down, wiped my hands on a rag, and spent an hour fixing the axle with superglue and a paperclip. Leo had hugged my neck, smelling like baby shampoo and sleep. "You can fix anything, Dad," he had said. I swallowed hard. My throat felt like it was lined with sandpaper. Through the 2 small porthole windows in the swinging doors, I could see fragments of the party. I watched the flashes of the photographer's camera, brilliant bursts of white light reflecting off the glass walls. I saw Warren gathering them together. Warren, his wife, Stella, and Leo. They posed. They smiled. They looked like a dynasty. There was no gap where I should have been. The picture was complete without me. A plate slid onto the stainless steel counter next to my elbow. I looked up. It was a young cook, maybe early 20s, with a patchy beard and a burn scar running up his forearm. He pushed a small porcelain dish toward me. It held a piece of steak, medium rare, resting on a bed of puree. "Messed up the presentation on this one," he muttered, not making eye contact. "Chef wouldn't let it go out. Figured you might be hungry." He didn't wait for a thank you. He just turned back to his station. I stared at the meat. My stomach turned over, protesting the rich smell of truffles and seared fat. I picked up a fork and pushed the steak around the plate. Why was I sitting here? The question bloomed slowly in the back of my skull. It started as a whisper and grew into a low, steady thrum. Why was I letting them do this? Because of Leo. Because I didn't want to embarrass my son. Because ever since his mother passed away, I had bent over backward to keep him in my life. I paid his tuition at the out-of-state university he insisted on attending. I kept my mouth shut when he started correcting my grammar. I smiled when he brought Stella home, even though she looked at my house like it was a contagious disease. I retreated. I made myself smaller, quieter, less obtrusive, all so my son wouldn't feel burdened by his blue-collar, unpolished father. I had spent a decade slowly erasing myself to fit into the margins of his life. I looked through the porthole window again. Leo was holding a glass of champagne, leaning in to listen to Warren. Leo nodded eagerly at whatever the older man was saying. He wasn't a hostage. He wasn't being manipulated by his wealthy in-laws. He was a willing participant. He had chosen them. He had traded me in for an upgrade. The profound, crushing sadness in my chest began to harden. The edges crystallized. The wet shame evaporated, leaving behind something dry, hot, and intensely focused. I put the fork down. The metal clattered loudly against the porcelain. I didn't want to fix the toy truck anymore. I wanted to break the axle. I stood up from the aluminum stool. The legs screeched against the tiled floor, drawing a few glances from the line cooks, but I didn't care. I smoothed the front of my cheap suit. I didn't walk back into the main room. I wasn't going to give Warren the satisfaction of seeing me skulk back in, waiting for my assigned seat at the furthest table. Instead, I pushed through the heavy metal fire door at the back of the kitchen. The alarm had been disabled for the caterers to bring in supplies. The door clicked shut behind me, cutting off the noise of clattering pans and yelling chefs. The night air was cool, biting through my thin jacket. The smell of pine needles and damp earth was a sharp, welcome contrast to the cloying scents inside. I stood on the gravel driveway, near the caterers' vans. Beyond them, parked in the shadows away from the valet line, was my truck. An older model, Ford F-150. Scratched, dented, but the engine hummed perfectly. I walked over to it, my footsteps crunching loudly in the quiet night. I unlocked the door, climbed into the driver's seat, and shut it. The cab smelled like stale coffee and old leather. It smelled like me. I didn't start the engine. I just sat in the dark, my hands resting on the steering wheel. I gripped the worn leather cover, feeling the familiar grooves under my calluses. They thought I was just an old mechanic, a garbage man who got lucky with a small fleet of trucks. That was the narrative Leo liked to spin to his new friends. My dad's in sanitation, a real salt-of-the-earth guy. It sounded folksy. It sounded harmless. Leo was an idiot. He had a master's degree in finance, but he didn't know a damn thing about money. Warren certainly didn't know. Warren ran a boutique logistics and shipping firm, high-end imports, art, luxury cars, custom furniture. He wore Italian suits and drank gin that cost more than my first car. But 3 years ago, Warren's firm had taken a massive hit. Cargo ships backed up, a bad bet on a warehouse expansion in the wrong district, and suddenly, Warren was bleeding cash. Fast. Leo had come to my house at 2 a.m. He was crying. He said Stella was having panic attacks. Warren was facing bankruptcy, maybe even fraud charges for moving client money around to cover his debts. They were going to lose the house. They were going to lose the firm. Dad, you have to help us, please. I know you have money put away. I didn't just have money put away. I had spent 35 years building a regional waste management empire, buying up scrap yards, industrial real estate, and municipal contracts. I didn't wear a Rolex, but I owned the land the Rolex dealership was built on. I agreed to help, but I didn't just write a check. I wasn't stupid. I had my financial manager, Harvey, set up a holding company, an anonymous LLC based out of Delaware. Through that LLC, I bought Warren's debt, all of it. I injected the capital to save his firm, took over the mortgage on his estate, and structured it as a high-interest, callable loan. Leo knew it was my money, but he begged me not to tell Stella or Warren. He said it would destroy Warren's pride. He said it would ruin his marriage if Stella knew her father was bailed out by her blue-collar father-in-law. Like a fool, like a loving, pathetic father, I agreed to remain a ghost. I let Warren keep his pride. I let him keep his illusion of superiority, all while I held the pink slip to his entire life in a manila folder in my home safe. Over the last 3 years, Leo had conveniently forgotten who held the leash. The crisis passed, the money stabilized, and Leo went back to pretending I was an embarrassing relic of his past. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. The screen glared brightly in the dark cab. It was a Saturday night, but Harvey didn't sleep much. I found his name in my contacts and pressed call. The phone rang twice. Frank. Harvey's voice came through the speaker, gravelly and alert. It's almost 11. Tell me someone died, or tell me we're buying something. Neither, Harv, I said, leaning my head back against the headrest. I stared up through the windshield at the stars, barely visible through the light pollution of the estate. I need you to open the files on the Vanguard Holdings LLC. There was a brief pause on the line, the sound of a keyboard clacking. Vanguard, that's the Warren account, the silent bailout. What's going on? Read me the terms of the primary loan on his commercial real estate. More clacking. Okay, pulling it up. Standard distressed asset terms. You gave him a lifeline, but we built in the fail-safes like you asked. It's a demand loan, Frank. You can call the principal at any time, for any reason, with a 30-day notice. If he fails to liquidate and pay, we seize the collateral. The collateral being the firm's assets and his personal residence. And what happens if I call it on Monday? I asked softly. Harvey chuckled, a dry, reedy sound. If you call it Monday, Warren doesn't have the liquidity. The market is tight. No bank is going to refinance a loan that size in 30 days. He'd default. You'd own his company by the end of the quarter, and he'd be packing boxes in his living room. I listened to the hum of the refrigerator trucks running near the caterers' vans. I thought about the sweat on the young cook's forehead. I thought about the cold metal stool. Then I thought about Warren's hand gripping my bicep. Go sit with the kitchen staff, Frank. Harv, I said, my voice steady, devoid of any tremble or hesitation. Draft the demand letters. All of them. The commercial loans, the mortgage, the whole stack. You sure, Frank? This is going to drop a nuclear bomb on your son's family. I'm sure, I said. Have the couriers deliver the papers to his office at 9 a.m. on Monday. Require a physical signature. Done, Harvey said. He didn't ask questions. He knew me better than my own son did. Anything else? Yeah. See if you can find out who his caterers are tonight. The staff was good. I want to send them a tip. I hung up the phone. The cab went dark again. I sat there for another 5 minutes, just breathing in the smell of old coffee and leather. The crushing weight that had been sitting on my chest since I walked into the kitchen was gone. In its place was a cold, terrifying clarity. I wasn't going to drive away. Driving away meant retreating. Driving away meant I was the beaten old dog limping down the highway. I opened the truck door and stepped back out onto the gravel. I buttoned my cheap jacket. I walked back toward the house, bypassed the kitchen entirely, and walked up the front steps, right through the massive oak double doors. It was time to enjoy the party. Music from the string quartet swelled as I stepped back into the main hall, the frantic cellos replaced by a slow, dragging violin piece that felt like a funeral dirge. Waiters moved in synchronized lines, carrying heavy silver trays loaded with plates of roasted pheasant and root vegetables. The ambient hum of wealthy people discussing stock splits and vacation homes washed over me. Nobody noticed my return. I was invisible, exactly as I had been designed to be in this ecosystem. My shoes sank into the plush Persian rug. I bypassed the dark corners. I ignored the shadowy alcoves where I had spent the last 3 hours trying to minimize my physical footprint. Instead, I walked directly toward the center of the room. The main dining table was a massive slab of live-edge walnut, stretching 20 feet down the middle of the floor. Tall crystal candelabras cast flickering, buttery light across the bone-white china. Place cards, written in thick black calligraphy, marked the seating arrangements. I walked slowly down the length of the table. I found Stella's name. I found Leo's name. Next to Leo was Warren. Next to Warren was his wife, Pamela. I kept walking until I reached the opposite end of the head table. A small, stiff card read, Gregory Hamilton, City Council. Gregory Hamilton hadn't shown up. I knew this because I had overheard Pamela complaining to a caterer earlier about an empty seat throwing off her symmetry. I grabbed the back of the heavy, velvet-upholstered chair. I pulled it out. The wooden legs scraped loudly against the floorboards. A harsh, ugly sound that momentarily cut through the polite murmurs of the nearby guests. I sat down. The tablecloth felt like spun glass under my rough fingertips, impossibly smooth and cold. I picked up the heavy linen napkin, shook it out with a snap, and draped it over my lap. It took exactly 45 seconds for Warren to notice. I watched him from down the table. He was mid-laugh, holding a glass of dark red wine, leaning toward a man in a velvet smoking jacket. Warren's eyes drifted casually down the length of the walnut slab, scanning his audience. His gaze hit me. The laugh died in his throat. Even from 20 feet away, I saw the blood drain from his tanned face, leaving behind a sickly, yellowish pallor. He blinked, hard, as if staring at a hallucination. His jaw muscles flexed. He set his wine glass down on the table. The stem hit the wood with a sharp clack. He whispered something to Pamela, patted her shoulder, and began walking toward my end of the table. His stride was rigid. His forced smile was a grotesque mask, stretched too tight over his teeth. "Frank," he said, arriving at my shoulder. He kept his voice low, a furious whisper vibrating with suppressed panic. "What on earth are you doing here? This seat is reserved." "Gregory couldn't make it," I said, not looking up. I picked up a heavy silver fork and inspected the tines. Figured I'd keep the symmetry intact. Pamela was worried about the aesthetics. Warren leaned down. I could smell the juniper from his breath again, mixed now with the sour metallic odor of sudden stress. "You need to get up. Right now. You are embarrassing, Stella. You are embarrassing, Leo." I slowly turned my head. I looked directly into his eyes. There was no apology in my gaze. There was no submission. The deferential, quiet mechanic he thought he knew was gone, replaced by a man who had spent 3 decades crushing scrap metal and surviving cutthroat municipal bidding wars. "I'm eating dinner, Warren," I said, my voice steady, flat, and carrying perfectly in the small space between us. "If you try to remove me, I will make a noise. I will flip this table. I will break these glasses." "Do you want that kind of aesthetic for the photographer?" Warren froze. His eyes darted nervously to the surrounding guests. A woman across the table was already glancing our way, pretending to sip her water. Warren swallowed hard. "You are a small, bitter man, Frank." "Sit down, Warren," I replied softly. "Your pheasant is getting cold." He stared at me for another second, pure hatred radiating off him in waves. But he had no leverage. He cared too much about the optics. He spun on his heel and marched back to his seat. Dinner commenced. It was a suffocating affair. The food tasted like damp cardboard. The wine, poured from bottles covered in dust and French labels, burned the back of my throat like cheap solvent. From down the table, Leo finally looked at me. His face was a portrait of sheer terror. He kept darting his eyes from me to Warren, trying to calculate the damage. I didn't smile at him. I didn't offer a reassuring nod. I just chewed my food, methodical and slow. When the plates were cleared, the speeches began. Warren stood up, tapping a butter knife against his crystal water goblet. The ringing sound silenced the room. He buttoned his suit jacket, projecting an aura of total control. He was putting on a show, desperate to reclaim the evening's narrative. "Family and friends," Warren started, his voice booming with practiced resonance. "5 years ago, I gave away my greatest treasure, but I didn't lose a daughter. I gained a son." He gestured to Leo. Leo smiled. "A weak, trembling thing. Leo," Warren continued, "you have integrated into this family seamlessly. You understand what it means to build something, to maintain a legacy. In this room we have builders, we have creators, we have people who understand that wealth isn't just about money. It's about cultivation. It's about surrounding yourself with excellence. and cutting away the dead weight that holds you back. Warren paused. He looked down the table, locking eyes directly with me. The room fell utterly silent. Sometimes, Warren said, his voice dropping to a theatrical, solemn pitch, people simply don't fit into the future you are building. They belong to a past that must be outgrown, and that is okay, because true legacy requires sacrifice. He raised his glass. To Leo and Stella, to the future, and to leaving the past exactly where it belongs. To Leo and Stella, the room echoed. Glasses clinked. I didn't raise my glass. I sat perfectly still, listening to the applause. Warren thought he had delivered a killing blow. He thought he had publicly humiliated me, dressing it up in polite metaphors. He thought he had won. I picked up my cloth napkin, wiped my mouth, and placed it neatly on the table. I stood up. The chair scraped again. I didn't say a word. I didn't look at Leo. I just turned and walked out of the dining room, down the long hallway, and out the front doors. The night air hit me, cold and clean. I walked to my battered truck, started the engine, and drove down the winding hill. I went home. I slept for 8 hours. I woke up. I made coffee, and I waited for Monday. Rain hammered against the corrugated tin roof of my office trailer. It was a rhythmic, deafening sound, the kind of heavy, relentless downpour that turns the dirt yard into a thick, unnavigable stew of mud and rusted flakes of iron. My scrapyard sat on 20 acres of industrial land on the extreme eastern edge of the city limits, bordered by a sluggish brown river and a concrete overpass. Mountains of twisted steel, crushed sedans, and oxidized copper wire loomed in the gray morning light right outside my window. The trailer smelled of diesel fuel, damp topsoil, and the bitter, burnt black coffee sitting in a cheap plastic machine on the corner of my desk. I wore my standard work clothes, heavy denim, steel-toed boots, scuffed white at the caps, and a thick flannel shirt that had lost its original color a decade ago. Condensation beaded on the single-pane glass of the window. I wiped it away with the side of my thumb, leaving a streak of grease across the pane. Outside, a magnetic crane hoisted the crushed, mangled chassis of a yellow taxicab into the air. Water poured off the compressed metal like a waterfall. At exactly 9:45 in the morning, the phone on my desk rang. It was not my cell phone. It was the heavy black landline sitting next to a stack of unpaid invoices. I only used that line for municipal contract disputes or emergencies. The ring was shrill, mechanical, and grating. I let it ring 3 times. I stared at the beige plastic receiver. My chest felt tight, a dull ache radiating outward from my breastbone. I knew who it was. Harvey's couriers were efficient. They would have dropped the boxes at Warren's sleek downtown office right at 9. It took 45 minutes for the panic to set in, for the frantic phone calls to be made, for the realization to finally trickle down to my son. I reached out. My knuckles cracked as I picked up the receiver and brought it to my ear. Frank speaking. Dad. Leo's voice cracked instantly. It was a raw, wet, ugly sound, completely devoid of the polished, slow corporate cadence he had spent the last 5 years perfecting. He sounded exactly like the terrified 12-year-old boy who had once broken his mother's favorite ceramic lamp and tried to hide the pieces under the sofa. "Hello, Leo," I said. I leaned back in my cheap vinyl chair. The springs groaned loudly beneath my weight, a harsh protest in the small room. "Dad, what did you do?" he whispered. Panic vibrated fiercely through the copper wire, a tangible electric current of pure dread. "What the hell did you do?" "I don't know what you're talking about," I replied. My voice was calm, an anchor dropping into his turbulent sea. I kept my eyes fixed on the crane outside. "Warren just got a courier package," Leo stammered, his breath hitching audibly. "From Vanguard Holdings. The demand letters. They called the loans, Dad. All of them. The commercial real estate, the business credit lines, the mortgage on the estate. 30 days. They want $28 million in 30 days. Dad, they want everything." "That sounds like a severe liquidity problem for your father-in-law," I said, picking up a dull pencil and rolling it between my calloused palms. The yellow paint flaked off onto my skin. "Dad, stop it." Leo screamed. It was a frantic, desperate noise that tore at his vocal cords. I know Vanguard is you. I know it's your holding company. You promised me. 3 years ago, you stood in my kitchen and promised you would never use this against him. You promised you'd stay a silent partner. A lot of things change in 3 years, Leo, I said. Economic climates shift, investments sour, and promises unfortunately expire when the terms of respect are breached. He's destroying his office right now, Dad. He's literally throwing glass paperweights at the walls. Stella is hyperventilating on the floor of the boardroom. If they default, they lose absolutely everything. They lose the logistics firm. They lose the house. We live in that house, Dad. We'll be out on the street. You have a master's degree in finance from a Tier 1 university. I reminded him, my voice dropping to a cold, hard register that I usually reserved for shady contractors. You will find a job. You can rent a 2-bedroom apartment. Millions of people do it every single day. You aren't allergic to drywall and linoleum, Leo. There was silence on the line, save for the sound of Leo's ragged, wet breathing. He was crying. I could hear the thick tears catching in the back of his throat. A massive, instinctual part of my chest tightened. My biology screamed at me to stop, to comfort my child, to tell him it was just a scare tactic and I would call Harvey and cancel the whole thing. I wanted to protect him. I had spent my entire adult life breaking my own back just to put shoes on his feet and food in his stomach. But I stamped that urge down. I visualized the gleaming kitchen at the anniversary party. I felt the cold metal of that aluminum stool against my legs. I smelled the truffles. I felt Warren's manicured thumb digging into my bicep. Why are you doing this? Leo sobbed, the anger finally bleeding through his terror. Because he insulted you at a party? Because he told you to sit in the back with the caterers? Dad, he's just like that. He's a snob. We all know it. You didn't have to nuke our entire lives over one petty, drunken insult. It wasn't the insult, Leo, I said quietly. The pencil snapped in my hands. The sharp crack made me flinch. I tossed the broken yellow wood into the tin trash can by my feet. Then what was it? It was you. The line went dead quiet. Even his frantic crying paused, suspended in the heavy air. Warren is a snake, I continued, staring at the scarred, coffee-stained surface of my desk. I always knew exactly what Warren was. A snake bites because it is a snake. It acts according to its nature. I don't blame the snake. But you stood there, 20 feet away. You looked directly at me, your father, while another man treated me like discarded garbage. And you checked your watch. You checked the silver watch I bought you. You turned your back. You laughed. Dad, I didn't want to make a scene. You made a choice. I interrupted, my voice hardening into steel. You chose his world. You chose his money. You chose his fake, hollow legacy. You were so utterly terrified of losing your little seat at his walnut table that you let him banish me to the kitchen. I was scared, Leo yelled, the words dissolving into a wail. I rely on him. He gave me a job as a vice president. He gave me a life. No, Leo, I corrected him, the absolute truth of it tasting like bitter ash in my mouth. He gave you an empty title. I gave him the company. I gave him the house. I gave him the very ground you both walk on. And I did it all for you. I bought your security because you were too weak to build it yourself. I paused. I listened to the rain punishing the tin roof. The sound washed over me, cold and indifferent. But you don't respect me, I said. You're embarrassed by me. I'm just a dirty old man who hauls trash. You want to belong to Warren's family? Fine, go belong to it. But Warren's family is broke. Warren's family is built on lies, bad debts, and my money. I'm just recalling my capital. Dad, please, Leo begged. His voice was a pathetic, broken whisper. I'll do anything. I'll come see you. I'll apologize. I'll make Warren get on his knees and apologize to you. We can fix this. Please, Dad. I'm your son. No, we can't, I said, feeling a terrible, hollow void open up inside my stomach. Some broken axles can't be fixed with superglue and paper clips. They're just broken. You're going to bankrupt us, he cried. You're taking everything. I'm taking back what's mine, I said softly. You have 29 days left to figure out your living situation. Do not call this number again. I hung up the phone. I didn't slam it down. I placed it gently, meticulously, back onto its black cradle. The silence in the trailer was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. The fierce adrenaline that had carried me through the weekend, the righteous anger, the cold clarity of revenge evaporated instantly. It left behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. My shoulders slumped. The air in the room felt too thick to breathe. I looked down at my hands. I examined the permanent black grease stains embedded deep under my thumbnails. I traced the thick calluses on my palms. I had spent my entire life working these hands to the bone to build a massive, impenetrable fortress for my son. I had built walls of cash, property, and security to keep him absolutely safe from the cold, hard struggles I had faced as a young man. But in building that giant fortress, I had accidentally locked myself outside of it. I had created a perfect, pristine world for him that had absolutely no room for a man with dirt on his shoes. I reached out and slowly opened the bottom drawer of my desk. Inside, sitting on top of a stack of old yellowed freight invoices, was a faded photograph in a cheap plastic frame. It was Leo at his high school graduation. He was wearing a shiny, rented blue gown, smiling widely with metal braces on his teeth, holding his diploma up to the camera. I was standing right next to him. I was wearing my greasy work coveralls because I had rushed straight from a burst pipe at the yard just to make it to the auditorium in time. In the picture, Leo had his arm wrapped tightly around my neck. He didn't care about the grease. He looked so incredibly proud of me. I stared at the picture for a very long time. The edges of the frame began to blur. A single tear, hot and stinging, broke free from my eyelashes and ran down the deep, weathered creases of my cheek. It stopped at the corner of my mouth. It tasted like salt, rust, and absolute defeat. I had won the war. I had utterly destroyed the arrogant man who humiliated me. I owned the multi-million-dollar estate. I owned the shipping company. I held all the power, all the cards, all the leverage. I was the king of the board. But sitting alone in the damp, freezing trailer, listening to the relentless rain beat against the tin, I had never felt so utterly, completely impoverished. I slowly closed the drawer, shutting the smiling face of my boy away in the dark. I pushed my chair back and stood up. I zipped my heavy canvas jacket up to my chin. I walked over to the door and pushed it open, stepping out into the pouring rain. The cold water soaked through my clothes instantly. Out in the yard, there was scrap metal waiting to be crushed. The massive, hydraulic machines didn't care about feelings. The machines didn't care about betrayal, or pride, or broken families. The machines only knew how to take things apart. And right now, out in the mud and the noise, that was the only work I had left to do. Family dynamics can shatter when pride and wealth cloud our judgment. Frank's revenge wasn't a triumphant victory. It was a tragic, necessary severing of toxic ties. He lost his son to a world of hollow status, realizing too late that buying love only builds prisons. If this raw story of betrayal and consequences hit home for you, please hit the like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our video for more deep dives into complex human stories.